Hey guys, in this video, instead of making a song, I'm going to talk about how I use Ableton Live to start a project, to record tracks, to mix, to master, and generally my kind of process of making these songs that you've seen in my videos in the past. So a few people have asked me for this, so I'm by no means a mixing or mastering expert, or those two are probably my biggest weaknesses, so that's why I never really made videos on it. But I'll still just talk about how I approach it, and hopefully somebody in the comments who knows more than me can help me out and give me suggestions of something I'm doing wrong, and maybe some of you will learn something along the way as well. All projects, I start off like this. This is my default template. I have two channels here, both one set to channel 1, one set to channel 2, because I have a 2-channel interface at the moment. And I have this Valhalla Room reverb as a return effect here that I can blend in here. And that's just my go-to kind of vanilla generic default reverb that I like to sprinkle on things. And I rarely have to change it, so I like that it's there. And one cool shortcut that I like here is Command F or Control F, which is just a search shortcut. But I like this for introducing instruments as well, because it's much faster than going in the browser. So for example, let's say I wanted to load a instance of analog. You would just do Command F, type in analog, and then press down on the keyboard, press enter, and it just opens up a new track, and then you're ready to play. And so that's a really cool way to just add new things, and same for effects. So I can type this, type echo, press down, enter, and it instantly adds an echo. So from then on, like I said, I like to kind of pre-envision the structure of the song to avoid getting stuck in just making a 4-bar loop. And the way I like to do that is by placing markers. So if you right click up here, you can add a locator and you can name it. So typically I would start something, I would say intro, and then I would count, okay, maybe that's a 4-bar intro. Then I would add a verse here, and just keep going like that, and maybe add a chorus. What's helpful is that once you have a ton of different tracks, I can't do it now, but as you scroll down, you start losing the meter here, and you start losing your place in the song when you have a lot of tracks. So it's helpful to have these vertical lines just kind of as guidelines. So the next thing I like to do is fill in some kind of foundation. Let's say I wanted to add a 808 chord kit, just for example's sake here. So let's say I wanted to just record a simple thing here. I would just enable looping here and then kind of drag this out here. And at this point, I'll probably get rid of these, because if I'm not doing an audio-based track and more of a MIDI-based track, I'll just get rid of those. And at this stage, what I like to do is kind of think breadth first before going too deep down any one track. So for example, add all the drums across the whole board, then add all the bass across the whole board, then add all the pianos or whatever instruments you're using. You get the point. Just kind of keep adding layers that span the whole track. Even if it's super vanilla and kind of boring and rudimentary, think of it as a sketch pad. Like many artists, right? A lot of professional kind of visual artists, they don't start off with the final masterpiece in one stroke. Usually there's kind of a rough draft, and then they keep adding layers on top of that. So think of this as that initial stencil where you're just kind of setting the kind of core foundation. And then from then on, you can go back and you can always remove things and change them. And it could end up at the end that I get rid of this completely and replace it with another beat. But once you have that foundation, then it's much easier to build on top of it, rather than if you started like I used to do a lot, with just kind of having like 30 different tracks of a 4-bar loop. And then it's really hard at that point to expand into the full song. Again, it depends on the genre, and there are tons of caveats here, so don't take anything I say as like gospel or rules or anything like that. This is just generally how I like to approach this kind of stuff. And from that point on, that's all I keep doing. I don't worry about the mixing or EQing or volumes or panning or anything. Panning sometimes if it's for effect purposes, but usually in my first pass, I like to just think about purely the music itself, the arrangement, the rhythm, the chords, the structure, the general kind of mood of the song. All right, so here I've loaded up the track I've used for my previous video, and check that out if you haven't seen it yet. It's the kind of Latin cha-cha-cha rap song. And so as you can see, the structure is like I described before. I put my markers around so that I know roughly what's going on. And here's what I was talking about before. As you have a lot of tracks, and there's not a lot here, but once you have more than a couple, when you start scrolling down, if I didn't have these markers, I wouldn't actually know where my beginning was, because there's no reference point here. So having these white lines going down helps me kind of visualize where I need to place things, especially as you zoom out. And so yeah, the way I did this was I literally just kind of played a part, create a new track, play a part, create a new track, play a part, pretty standard stuff. And And then towards the end of the video, I added some more percussion. I added an 808 here to keep it interesting. When I'm done recording the actual parts, the first thing I do is I go over every part and I name all my tracks just to make it easier to mix later. So I name it simple things like piano, bass, guitar, and depending on the complexity, well, this one I forgot to name because I added this later and I got lazy, but this is effectively what I would do. And if you're new to Ableton, what I just did there is if you click on the track, you press Command R, it turns it into rename mode, and then you can just type in something. So the next thing I do is, and this is the part where I'm just kind of doing it based on what makes sense to me, and this might not be the right way to do it, but this is when I start thinking about mixing a little more. And the first thing I usually do is I press Command A to select all my tracks, and then I just drag the volume all the way down to 0. I'm not going to do it here, but effectively I make all my tracks start at 0. And then I would tap over to the session view, which has a better mixer view here. And then I would just play the song at the beginning or somewhere in the middle. And I would go from left to right and just start bringing things in until they peak around minus 12 dB here. And just roughly putting them in that area so that I have a bit of headroom on all the different tracks. And as I'm adding new things, I'm just kind of playing it by ear, like literally just hearing what it sounds like and seeing how the things blend together as I bring them up slowly. And at this stage, I would also, once I've done that one pass and make sure everything is leveled, I would start playing around with panning a little bit just for like effect. In this case, I panned the guitars, the trumpets, just to kind of spread it out a little bit. And at this stage, I would also maybe think about sending some reverb. And in this one, you'll notice that I only put it on the trumpet because I've actually used the reverb that was built into the Cuba plugin here. So there's natural reverb coming from the plugin, so I didn't have to add the Valhalla. But in other cases, you would probably see my sends being a bit higher here. And overall, for me, the approach is, because I'm not good at mixing or mastering or anything like that, I want to keep things as simple as possible and as good as possible in the raw original sound so that I don't get too overwhelmed. Once I have that rough level in, I will then go and literally slap a high pass EQ on every single track, except sometimes the drums or the bass, depending on which one I want to kind of stand out. So I just play it by ear, and I do slightly visual tweaks as well. So I would play this, for example, and then I would see roughly where the kind of most important frequencies are of the piano, for example. And sometimes I would solo it to hear if it lost too much of its bottom end. But like you know, for mixing purposes, it's not enough that the thing sounds good on its own. Sometimes on its own it sounds terrible, but it sounds good in the mix. So you have to kind of balance the two together. But roughly, I'm not afraid of kind of kicking out a lot of the low end, especially for these higher range instruments. For the bass, I've obviously clipped it a bit lower here because it's a bass, but I didn't want to make it too low because I wanted that super heavy 808 kick to somehow come through. And I've also low passed the kick as well because that upright bass has a lot of kind of energy, and because I have a lot of high energy sounds like the piano, the trumpet, the guitar, I didn't want that bass to kind of muddy up the high end too much. But for the most part, my EQs are super vanilla, and I'm not using any third-party plugins. I just slap a EQ8 from Ableton, and I literally just played by ear /eye and roughly just high pass everything. That's kind of my vanilla go-to for everything. And then usually on the bass, I would add a glue compressor just to kind of squeeze it out a little bit. But I don't use compressors too much. Maybe, well, on all my vocals, I always add a standard compressor and an EQ, and I EQ it pretty high because I like that kind of breathy, like crisp vocal, especially for this kind of rap song where I want that vocal to kind of stick through. And I keep the vocals 100% dry. So yeah, that's generally how I think about it. The compressor, I just move the threshold down till it's kind of, you see a little bit of gain reduction. And I typically put an auto release, and the attack, I make it a tad slow. Again, I'm just kind of playing it by ear and kind of just setting rough medium settings because I'm not an expert in any of these particular things. So I don't want to take anything into too many extremes because at that point I don't know what I'm doing. So I just want to compress the vocal because it's hard for me. I'm not a vocalist naturally, so my dynamics are all over the place. So I like to just put a compressor to kind of even that out because there's a lot of kind of me going sometimes in at the mic, sometimes exaggerating some words. And then on this 808 kick, I just added, I like adding the drum bus plugin from Ableton because this boom feature is pretty sweet. It can like really punch out your low end on your kicks. And then I kind of sculpted it here because I have this competing other kick. I wanted to scoop out that kick here and leave room for the bass as well. And I found that the high energy was a little too harsh for this song, so I added a bit of low pass in the EQ here. And that's basically it. I don't do anything fancy. I'm just using EQ8 primarily on everything. In this case, I'm using a lot of like acoustic instruments, so I didn't want to add too many like effects like chorus, flanger, or anything unnatural. So I wanted to keep this one pure. So this one is a more minimal than my average stuff, but even in my more like extreme affected ones, I'm still trying to be very minimal. Since I'm working on a time crunch, I'm trying to pump out these videos almost daily, and I'm trying to keep myself sane, but also keep the music kind of as minimal as possible in terms of how many things I'm adding, because the more things you add, the more variables there are, and then it just gets out of control. So what I do at this point is I would listen to this on my monitors here, just kind of go through it, listen to the whole song, and then close my eyes, lean back on my chair, and kind of try to see if anything sticks out. Once I'm roughly happy, I mute my monitors, I put on my headphones, and I do the same thing. I go over it and see if anything sticks out too much. And then I do a little bit of tweaking, and then I go back on the monitors, make sure I didn't like break anything by listening on the headphones. Then when I'm roughly happy with the thing, I'll just drag out this loop bar here to capture the full song, and that allows me to export just this area here. So at this point, I would just export an AIF file. All right, so once I've exported that mix, I'll open up a new project and drag in that audio file here. In this case, I'm just adding some random drum loop for example purposes, but I'll get rid of everything else. And then in this audio track, I'll open this thing called Wide and Warm Master, which is an audio effect rack that comes with Ableton Live. And a rack is just a collection of effects. So in this case, it's just an EQ, a compressor, and a limiter. And at this stage, I use the macros here, and first I just tame things down so that they're not as extreme here. And the EQ is set to mid-side, which is a mode where instead of working on the left and right channels, it works on the middle and the two sides. And so here again, I just play it by ear. I tame these down so that they're not extreme. And then I just look at the compressor here and change its threshold to make sure that the gain reduction is not going too crazy, because you don't want to, or at least in this case, I don't want to over compress my master, because then it's maybe a symptom that I didn't do something right in the mixing stage. So yeah, I would maybe point to the more busy hype part of the song and then focus on that. So make sure that that only has a little bit of gain reduction, so that the rest is the dynamics are relatively intact. And then I just increase the gain of the compressor till my limiter is peaking just a little bit. This is just to kind of roughly bring the levels up in case my mix was quiet overall. But that's it. I don't do anything too fancy. Again, I just use my ears. I kind of sit back in my chair, and then I play with this mid gain here to see if it makes it sound better or worse. Again, I'm by no means a mastering expert. I don't know if you would even call this mastering, but it's just kind of a final touch for me, just to like bring the volume slightly up and do some minor tweaks here and there. So yeah, that's basically my process. At this point, I'll just select this and then export the final AIF and then use that to upload it to Spotify and put it in my videos. So yeah, hopefully you found this interesting. If anybody found anything that I'm doing that is inefficient or wrong, if you have any tips for me for mixing or mastering, and if you will have any suggestions, this is the area I really want to learn the most in. So definitely share your tips and shout at me if I'm doing something obvious that could be improved or made more efficient. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next.